Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Scrubbed In Show. I hope you've all been keeping well. This week we have with us another incredible guest. We have with us Dr. Keith Grimes, who, as many of you already know, is a digital health and innovation specialist. And I'm sure a lot of people know about Babylon. He was Director of Clinical Product Management there, and since then has been doing a lot of advisory work, commenting, sharing his thoughts, particularly on the transition from clinical medicine to product management and the roles clinicians can do beyond medicine. So it's an absolute pleasure having you on the show, Keith. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Afternoon to you, Abdul and Ams. Great to see you, and great to be presenting today. So I'm doing good.
Thank you. Before we kind of talk about, the AI, digital health tech, all of those weird and wonderful things, we want to kind of take it a bit back and kind of talk about your motivations early on in your career to pursue medicine, to become a clinician.
Yeah, sure. So I'm getting older now. It's a shame. I always consider myself that. But so I went to medical school back in 1990, just to sort of set the scenes. I was a child of the 70s and 80s. And I was always way more into technology. My earliest memories are watching things like Thunderbirds, if you guys remember it, back on TV and stuff. So I was always well into computers and technology. But I was also quite good at school as well. I was academically did quite well. And as I got closer towards going to university, I had a few things in mind. And medicine was definitely in mind. But I kind of really wanted to write computer games. Because back in those days, it was like the Amiga, the Commodore Amiga was the big thing at the time. And but I did very well in my exams. And my parents kind of said, well, you got an opportunity to do one or two things. You can do medicine or law. And I was like, well, who wants to be a lawyer? I'll pursue the second thing, which was medicine. And, it had been in my mind anyhow. And, worked towards that. So I was at medical school from 1990 to 1996. And living in Aberdeen at the time, really enjoyed the clinical science side of things, really enjoyed it once as well when I got in front of patients as well. I think that's what really convinced me that going and sticking within medicine was going to be fun, because I really just enjoyed that aspect of it too. But I always had this kind of real passion for working with technology. I was a total geek and gamer, still am, and I was always trying to sort of find a way to bring that into it. And even in the early 90s, just as we were starting to get things like the internet and CD-ROMs were starting to come along and everything, the olden days, it was more limited about how you would get it into practice, but we still tried. And so my early experience of using tech in medicine was basically when I was a junior house officer, so equivalent of foundation officer, and or foundation year practice. And at that point, I was on a vascular ward. We'd have to go in and we'd have to write up all the lab tests, all the paper requests the night before the person was having the elective procedure. And I was able to use a database to help print that out. And, at that point, I suppose that was an indicator of how I was trying to use technology to sort of make my life easier, and just didn't think about asking anyone to do it, just did it, because I was using tech all the time otherwise. And that was essentially the spirit of how I brought technology and innovation into what I do going forward. I use it everywhere else. Why can't I use it in what I do as a doctor?
Funny enough, we still do the same thing. We still put out the paper request for bloods to be done on the day after. So nothing's changed on that front, Keith.
Oh my word. That's shocking. Yeah. That's like 25, 26 years or something like that.
Yeah, so we still do that. Despite certain aspects of that pathway kind of being digitalized. Tell us a bit more about kind of committing to transitioning out of clinical medicine into the world of tech. And what I'm interested to hear is, I know it wasn't as prevalent when you were practicing as it is now.
Yeah.
So tell us how the terrain was like back then.
Yeah, I mean, well, there was like the way to think about it is how it was described. So it was just described as IT or ICT. So let's think about this. Sort of mid-90s, junior doctor, it was just IT at that point, and everyone sort of recognized the use of it for things like word processing and sort of spreadsheets occasionally and stuff like that. But the idea of things being done in a network capacity were much less prevalent. As I tried to sort of find a way of doing technology in healthcare, there wasn't really any way forward. I mean, the best that people sort of said is like, well, they use technology in radiology, so why don't you give that a go? And or anesthetics, the anesthetists are always on their little, computers and things. So oddly enough, like the direction that I wanted to go was kind of, well, if they use it there, I might go in that direction. But along the way, along the way, I realized my love for sort of generalism. And so it was either kind of emergency. In fact, it was emergency medicine first. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. This is going to be just the ticket. I really like this kind of generalist approach. But there was this I was working in Inverness up in Scotland, and there was this GP that used to cover us in the afternoon. He said, oh, I was away to go to Australia for a year. He said, oh, when you come back, do GP for a wee bit and see what you think. Because back then, you could kind of make your own GP training. So I went out, did a bit of practice in the UK, went out to Australia for a year, did a bit of everything up in Brisbane. And then when I came back, I was able to just do a tiny bit more work and then do a GP registrar side of things. But again, I did that because I was impressed with what the guy said, but it was also like, well, where can I go and do some stuff with technology? And even then there was kind of no way in, there was no obvious way in of any sort. So I built the practice website back in 2000. I started using early PDAs, Palm Pilot and the stuff like, and then doing some stuff with JavaScript to do some calculations and bits and pieces like that. But again, people sort of thought it was like a kind of hobby more than anything. And at that point, we were transitioning over to electronic records. General practice has been pretty good in that area, actually. It's been quite advanced compared to the hospital side of things. And so then I was like, well, how am I going to get into like using technology in the NHS? And it was really hard. There was a program for implementation of electronic referrals and discharges up in Scotland. And I only found out about that because I basically made a pest of myself and was asking around saying, well, how do I get into this? How do I do this? Found someone who got me in as a sort of, the product doctor. But I had to kind of make up as I go along. And then when all that finished up, I came down to England back in 2005, worked in the out-of-hours service because I was really into out-of-hours clinical work. And I said, well, I really want to do some technology stuff. And they said, well, that's fine. If you do some clinical governance, we'll let you work that bit out. So all I ever did was clinical governance, of course, because there was no other tech stuff. So again, I tried to bring it in. It was only really about sort of 20, I did some informatics training as a postgraduate diploma as well, because I was trying to sort of say, well, how do I get into this? But the only way in within the NHS at that point was really sort of getting into the IT side of things, the kind of networks, the boxes, the sort of enterprise level software. There wasn't really much more than that. But come 2010 onwards, there was a sort of increasing interest in doing some things, mainly through technologically enabled care services, mostly to do with care homes and social care and remote monitoring, because that was already being done. So I got involved in some of that. And then in the local CCG, they needed someone to work on new innovations. And so once again, I was like, well, I'll do that. I'll do whatever it is to sort of get into this techie side of things. Got involved in the kind of the pipes and the boxes, the network stuff, but then did some referral management. And then slowly new stuff started to happen.
Yeah.
But at this point, I started to get very fed up. I was like, I've been a doctor for a while. It was really frustrating me that all this really cool stuff that I was seeing wasn't making it into practice. So I started in my holidays traveling over to America and going to some of the new digital health conferences.
Okay.
And that's when I really got excited by what was going on and started to try and bring that in. Again, no clear way into it. They started to talk about CCIOs, like Chief Clinical Information Officers, the Digital Health Academy or the Digital Academy in the NHS was coming up. I started learning more about entrepreneurship, but I probably wouldn't have got out of it all unless I'd got completely burnt out, which was another big feature. Like in 2017, I had to take 5 months off. I was really ill.
Oh, wow.
I burnt out really badly and was really depressed, anxious, the whole shooting match, and I had to take time off. And in retrospect, it was probably because I was trying to do lots of other things to get out and do what I really want to do, which is what I'm doing now. But there was no obvious way. So I paid the price, kind of recovered, and then when I came back, I said, no, I've really got to get out of it. At which point, Babylon came knocking. And I'd been given some talks about using VR, and at that point, the network effect came in, got into Babylon, and the rest is history.
Oh, wow.
Amazing.
So I can sense the ongoing frustration towards the end of that clinical practice of seeing things. Thank you for coming back, having been to Australia and America. I'm going to say that on behalf of everyone listening. But clearly you can see the frustrations, and I think, like you said, you would never expect someone like you, from what we see online and the work you've done, that you had burnout, you did have to take time off. Terrible. It just goes to show, there's more behind the scenes. So you joined Babylon, I believe, 2018, and then it became a rocket ship, and it's gone on to do incredible things. Tell us how you felt. So you're frustrated, and all of a sudden you have this opportunity. You're now doing something a bit more in aligned with your innate personality and traits. Was it a sigh of relief? Tell us a bit more about that feeling.
It was amazing. I won't lie. It was fantastic. I'd gone from this sort of situation to working in a rapidly growing scale up. Babylon had done a lot of good work beforehand, and
Mm.
so I joined when it was on this trajectory. But I came on when it was growing really fast. And I remember we used to do this thing at a stand-up, a weekly stand-up. And when we were smaller, we would all stand up. And Ali would be there, and he would introduce all the new people. And I joined on the day I joined. There was about 8 or 9 people joining. And I stood up and I said, this is like, it's taken me 28 years to find this place, because
Oh, wow.
1990 medical school to 2018,
Yeah.
like 28 years to find my tribe. I was like, I finally found people that are trying to do stuff that I want to do. So I was delighted. And there's a lot of reasons. Number one, it's a fast-growing, exciting place. So, I often joke that, when I joined Babylon, as compared to when I was working in general practice, I could go to the toilet whenever I wanted to. Like, I didn't have to sort of hold on till the end of the clinic, and there was always tea and coffee. In fact, there was always loads of stuff.
Yeah.
So I was really delighted just by that. But the thing that was most exciting was this kind of attitude towards being able to positively fix things. And I was working alongside like really brilliant other people, engineers, designers, product managers, user researchers, other doctors, commercial people, And so in some ways it was kind of like starting university again. I sort of met some people and I was like, right, I've got to work out what I need to do here. And I've got to work with other doctors who are coming on who are equally a little bit confused as to what's going on. And we can build something, but we're in a place where people are willing to go for it. And that was really, really refreshing. But at the same time, I was a doctor coming from the NHS into industry, and that's quite a transition. If you're a doctor that's been working, or anyone who's working in the NHS, you'll quite often only think of healthcare as only being provided in that form. In fact, you often tie your value as a doctor to being in the NHS, as in, outside the NHS. How could you even be a doctor outside the NHS because you don't have any other experience? And of course, that's kind of a bogus thing. But it takes a little while. It took me a little while to kind of wrap my head around it that, yeah, I'm still a doctor. Yeah, I'm still doing this, just in a different place. So a big thing that I tried to do when I was at Babylon is help people make that transition, to help say, you're going to start feeling a bit weird at this point. That's okay, and helping people through that point. That was a big thing. There's a mind change. Maybe it's less if you're working outside the NHS, but certainly in the NHS, see it time and time again. So anyone who's making that transition, you may have a few existential moments, but that'll pass.
Keith, I want to explore one thing before we move on here. So taking a step back now, talking about how you feel now, and it's all, you love what you're doing, you found your tribe, right? It's taken you a while to get there. You talked about doing loads and loads of different things, having loads and loads of different roles, and then burning out. Now, 2 questions at this point. One is, how would you suggest people go about finding their tribe if you went through so many different things, took on so many different roles, and it led to burnout? And the second question is, if you could go back to yourself, your 18-year-old self, and you could give some tips on how to get to where you are now quicker and find your tribe quicker, what would you advise?
Crikey, well, that's an interesting one. Okay, well, in some ways, I'm grateful for the path that it took, because my hope, and sorry, my dog's woofing in the background, but I think my real hope is that people going to medical school, or doctors training now, or any healthcare professional now, might be able to say, you know what, I want to be a digital doctor. I want to work in this particular space. And not only will they have some training in undergraduate, but I really dream of a time that there'll be a specialism within medicine. So I believe that I and other doctors like me are part of this kind of evolution of doctors who practice their medicine not through the patients that they see or the pills they prescribe, but through the products that they build. You sort of think about public health. It's a wee bit like that. I'm practicing my medicine at scale through the things that I do. But what I want is I want for me and for everyone that kind of comes alongside me or behind me to have this nice and clear, so they don't have to wait 28 years. Like I have some advantages through the experience that I've had. There's some positives about it, but I still think it was a long time to wait, and I could have avoided some of that distress along the way and burnout. So we can maybe talk a little bit about the ways into it and my thoughts on that in a moment. But if we just say, that's what I want, nice and clear way for people to move on. And there's different things we can talk about there. If I went back to when I was 18, there was an opportunity, oddly enough, in the first .com, like 2000. Actually, some doctors started to sort of split off and work there. Now, they found it very difficult to sort of stay in medicine as well. They basically had to leave completely. I sometimes wonder about if I had been a bit more bold at that time, which way it would have gone. Like, I don't know whether that would have been great advice, but I might have been a bit more bold about it to see. Of course, .com blew up anyway, but it would have been an interesting way into it. And I think the other bit of advice I would say is, if you're working as a doctor and there's something inside you saying that this isn't truly what you need to be doing, don't ignore it. Like talk about it. I mean, you may be able to resolve it, but I just stuffed it down for a bunch of time. And it's not really surprising that I burnt out, because I was kind of like not dealing with it. And then at some point my body was like, nah, bugger this, I'm just going to make you listen.
Yeah.
So I'd maybe say that as well, is say, like, really think about what it is that brings you joy. And if what you're doing right now isn't doing that, just, don't ignore it.
No, absolutely. No. And talking a little bit now, so now the doctors who are now listening to that voice within themselves, right? You just said a while ago about that. We tie our values to being a clinical doctor within the NHS. The idea of moving elsewhere, right? Before even thinking about applying for that job or networking with that person, the first thing is, hold on a minute, I'm going to have to leave. And then what often everyone does is they'll start locuming first, and then they'll drop 2 days, and then 1 day. And then it's like, it's nearly impossible. Like, how can I move across? And then all the perks that the NHS does provide in the sense that there is job security. You can get a locum job anywhere in the country pretty much. So there is that financial stability, whilst in industry, I'm not sure that's a given. When you advise people about getting over that, what are some of the most common ways you support people get past that, get through that when they've sort of made the leap?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing to say is where we are right now, there are some more supported routes out. And I want to be clear, I really dream of a world where people don't have to get out of the NHS to pursue this. We need to find a way to people to pursue it inside it too.
Absolutely.
But while that's being worked out, whilst that's being worked out, let's sort of think of a few things. Well, number one, there are ways, you can do locum work. I mean, the question then is like, well, then the time that you're not being a locum, how are you kind of getting into health, how are you getting into health tech is the other question. But the other one is, like, there's fellowships as well. There's lots of different fellowships out there. If you look at, there's a clinical AI fellowship. I'm talking specifically in England here, but there's the Topol fellowship. There's a clinical entrepreneur program. There's a lot of ways in which you can kind of continue to work in a kind of predictable way, but start to get the knowledge and skills and experience and contacts to move out. So that's number one. And then when I speak to some consultant colleague friends, they say, they offer quite a lot because of the difficulties in recruiting. They offer quite a lot of flexible working. So people can sort of be paid a full-time salary, but actually work, 2/3 time or 3/4 time, and then spend the rest of the time pursuing something else. So that might be one way into it. Or you can do locum work, of course. That suits GPs quite well, actually. GP locum work's pretty good in that regard. And then what you can do is there's different ways in which you sort of connect to the wider network. And so in part, there's really good, there's a few online resources as well. And so the one that got me into this side of things was Entrepreneurship. And Entrepreneurship was set up back in, I think it was about 2014, 15 or something like that, with Claire Noverall from Ada, Vishal Virani, and Avi Meher. Avi did that as well. I think I may have missed some people in there, but that was when I realized that you could take a wee bit more command over what was going on. So there's a good network there and opportunities. And then recently, Byte Labs started out as well. And Byte Labs is another interesting way in which is an 8-week-long course that's sort of done in the evening once a week, and a wee project that takes you through all the basics of what you need to know to practice in the sort of health tech space. And that's another good way into it. I still think that we're lacking a really good sort of single kind of sort of network or social space where we can all get together. But that's coming. I think, you have to sort of connect with a few people. So I spend a lot of time, people reach out to me because, like I say, I live online. And I'm happy to help direct and connect people too. But we kind of need as a group to kind of do a better job of it, so people don't have to hunt around so much. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's one way.
No, definitely. And I do think we are getting there. It's on our roadmap, which we'll probably share at some point. I agree with kind of allowing clinicians to scratch that itch per se while being a clinician. You know, maybe there is a rotation in, you know, when they're doing house training, foundation training, to do digital health and innovation. To kind of paint the picture a bit more and give it an insight, tell us a bit more about the role you did at Babylon, a clinical product manager.
Yeah.
I feel people are more familiar with what it is, but still don't know what it actually is.
Yeah. Okay. So when I came into Babylon, I was kind of brought in as a person that kind of had a lot of sort of skills and experience and could just work out what we did when we got in. You know, I was brought in to sort of work with some of the more junior doctors, because what they had is something called a clinical AI fellowship. And at the time, Babylon was offering this 1-year fellowship where you'd come on board and you'd be embedded with a product team and you'd learn by doing, basically, you know, be working on the Symptom Checker or the other products too. And that was awesome, you know. So I got to work with that group. We put together a curriculum to sort of help teach people the basics of, you know, fill in the gaps that they might need to know. But most of it was learned by doing and working alongside other people as well. I moved into sort of directing that. It was called the Guild. It was the Clinical AI and the Digital Health Guild. So I did that for a while. And then in the year before I left Babylon, I was getting more and more interested in like the world of product and product management. And product management is one of these ones that's terribly difficult to explain beyond the fact that as a product manager, your role is to identify the end user's problems and, you know, craft a solution to that particular problem. And that may seem like a very sort of simple description, but it's devilishly hard and actually contrary to how a lot of people work. So it's a combination of understanding the market and the commercial side of things, understanding what technology is out there, spending a lot of time understanding the problems that your end users face. Who are your end users? Who are your customers? Who are the people that pay for this? Identifying what things, you know, what the core features of the problem that you might want to try and solve, doing some discovery and development work over that, working with engineers and designers to make sure that this is feasible, that it is usable, that it generates value, because when you work, actually, whether you work in industry or not, you know, this has to deliver value somewhere, and that it's viable in the long term, that you can, you know, keep this all going. So you're juggling quite a lot of things as a product manager. And what's really interesting about it as well is that you're not directly in charge of anyone either. Like, you're not line managing anyone. So a lot of this comes down to coordination and influence and, you know, storytelling. It's a brilliant role to have. And it's not surprising that people, when go into health tech, they start to think, oh, I'd really like to be involved in that. And so in Babylon, we had our clinical subject matter experts, your doctors and nurses or whatever, working embedded in a product team. And this product team would be dedicated towards building out a particular feature in a product or a product itself. So you'd have a product manager, you'd have some engineers, designers, that kind of thing, some scientists, and you'd be providing the clinical subject matter expertise. And if it's a product that's working in a clinical space, you might call it a clinical product. The bit that I got interested in is about, well, what happens if you take a clinician and make them a product manager? Because what we had is we had a sort of subject matter expert alongside a product manager. And that's good. You know, you get lots of great expertise, but it also doesn't work sometimes because the product manager doesn't quite get to know everything about the domain, because they can always go to the subject matter expert. And the subject matter expert, the clinician in this case, doesn't quite have to bend as much the other way. Like, they say, well, I'm here for the clinical subject matter expertise, and this is what it has to be medically, and then you work out the rest. Now, that's a very bad example of what might happen. But even if you come closer together, have this bit of to and fro, and it can work very well. But my thinking was, well, actually, sometimes you might want to just have a clinician who is the product manager. And in that way, they have all that clinical expertise, but you're asking them to be the product manager. And what happens then is that let's say you've taught a doctor to become a product manager, and they're working in that area. you're getting them to work as a product manager. So they're having to identify the problem, look at the solutions, speak to all the different stakeholders, balance all the requirements, including the clinical requirements, but they're being responsible to balance them all. So all of a sudden you become much more kind of, equitable about where the weight is. But at the same time, because you are a doctor, there are some lines that deep down inside you that you can't cross, right?
Yeah.
Like I describe them as the landmines and the cliff edges, which means that you can move faster because you need to try and move fast and iterate. You have to be confident to do that. But at which point you go, hang on a second, right now, this is an area that we do need to pause or get some other things in.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was exploring. And I think in some circumstances, having a clinician as a product manager is a very valuable thing, particularly in high-risk products, and if you're trying to move quickly. But at the same time, a clinician as a product manager can sometimes be maybe a little bit more expensive. So something that the startups have to bear in mind. No,
definitely. I think you described it very well, concisely, and it just makes sense. And I think initially, as the space was emerging, it made sense to have it as separate. And as time goes on, clearly, like yourself, you've proven where it does make sense to have the clinician also being the product manager. Having spent, just over 4 years at Babylon as part of, the immense growth, just some advice. So, we've noticed a lot of health tech companies coming up, spinning, and then after a while, they kind of die down. They struggle to commercialize, they struggle to secure kind of those partnerships. Yeah. What are some of the barriers you think as to why some of these health tech companies are failing or struggling to do, and how can they overcome them?
I think, that's the kind of $1 million or the £1 million question, isn't it? But maybe some thoughts of, at least of mine, that might help in that situation. I think, first of all, the answers don't necessarily have to come from a doctor or a physio or anything. There doesn't have to, these solutions don't have to come from the current people in the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. But you're crazy if you try and make any changes without involving them at some point. And my argument would be, or my suggestion would be, that the sooner you can get a healthcare professional working with you or alongside you in the work that you do, the better. I think that's, I feel that very strongly. I believe there's evidence of that out there. Part of the work that I'm going to be doing going forward is trying to provide that kind of hard evidence base, because no matter how intuitive this makes sense, and it does kind of make sense if you're a clinician, you're like, well, of course this makes sense, but it's not generally accepted that that's necessary. In fact, sometimes people think, well, actually we're part of the problem, and actually we shouldn't really be in there. And it is true that if we've been brought up in the system, it can be difficult for us to conceive of solutions that aren't in some way shaped by that. We can't think as
outside
widely.
The box.
And that's really important too. So I think the best way to balance it is that you have someone who is from the healthcare system working with people that maybe aren't or have some background in there, but hold on to their experience kind of lightly or humbly. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, and constantly question yourself. I think that's really important. So generating that kind of mindset. It would be wonderful if we could teach things like product management at medical school, design-led thinking, that kind of stuff. It would be brilliant for medicine for a start. I often think about, as a product manager, how would I manage a patient? What's my MVP with them? But it's about getting that in. I think that's really important. Without that, a person can go quite a long way and then realize, oh crikey, I've built something that's not going to work. There's something that a nurse could say immediately, that's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So getting them in some form is really, really important. And this is where I think the route in for people like us, wanting to get into that space is how we do it and get paid along the way. These are important things. But that's in some ways that's kind of what I did informally by going out and just speaking to folk. So don't underestimate the power of that too.
On that front, Keith, of talking to people, right? It's a scary thing, networking, right? A lot of people think networking, what does that mean? Do I just randomly go up to someone and say, hey, where do you work? Do you mind letting me just shadow you for a week? But it's not as easy as that, and opportunities don't come like that. What does it mean in your books? How would you advise people go about connecting with each other? What's your tips and tricks on that?
Yeah. The first thing is go into it with a kind of generous sort of spirit as well. Like if you network thinking of yourself, it's never going to work. You think about the other people, be interested in the people, be genuinely interested in the people that you're meeting, listen to what they've got to say, learn from this, and then be generous with your time as well, because you've got some expertise that you may think very little of because it's, just what you know. I think that would be the first thing, is a sort of generous spirit to that, and just going along. There's the opportunities to go to events, within the NHS, outside the NHS, there's always events on health tech that you'll see advertised online, even in your locality or in your hospital. If you're still working within hospitals or something like that, there'll be opportunities to go along to speak to people. And the first part of networking, you don't have to say a thing. You just turn up and be there and see who's there and listen to what's going on and start sort of filling your head and letting the sort of knowledge and the connections start to form. Then you'll go to another one, and then you'll see someone else, and you'll be like, oh yes, you're there. And then you lay on top of that social media, being nicely connected on social media. So for preference, I use Twitter and LinkedIn, but there's many other ways. I'm not so good on TikTok, for example, but there's a growing group of people working in that area. And then contribute and comment. And what will happen off that is that people will start to recognize that you've got something interesting to say, whatever that is. You'll start learning along the way. And then from that, I think things will organically arise.
Yeah.
And that's maybe where the networking comes from. And I think Vishal was talking about this at Byte Labs recently. I think about, kind of generosity. It's like, don't go in there. If you go in there thinking that you're trying to sell something and then you're worried about what value you're generating, then you're going to end up sort of tongue-tied. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Get in there, meet some folk, and see how it goes. And then you'll find your wee groups, and then you'll see someone at the next event and so on, or you'll message someone. Goes from there.
And just on the front of now, you talked about social media and contributing now. Now, here's an interesting space for me and Abdul particularly, because we're trying to get more and more professionals into this game of contributing, sharing whenever there are any event about what they're learning, sharing it with other people and getting into discussion, debate and forming opportunities themselves. Talk to us about the importance of not just being a sort of a consumer on these social media apps, not just sitting down and actually tapping into, hold on a minute, I went to that health tech event or I went to that particular conference, and you know what, I should actually tell the world about what I've learned. Tell us a little bit about how important it is to share.
Well, it's really important, and by doing this and contributing, we elevate our understanding of this rapidly growing space. But I also recognize that it's not an easy thing for some people to do. I'm quite comfy speaking to folk, but some people may be less so. And then it's the same on social media, particularly if you're more junior in your career. You may think, well, get a wee bit of imposter syndrome, which never fully goes away. I hasten to add, you always get it if you move into new things. So I would say, contribute to the level at which you feel comfortable at this particular point, even if it's just like liking and retweeting or boosting posts or sharing content, or that is a starter for 10. Like, be a nice customer, like be a nice consumer. So for what you guys are doing, like sharing, liking, boosting, reviewing, all those sort of things, really important. From that, you can then reply or comment on things, or just ask questions, and doing so in a nice sort of polite, professional manner. You don't have to be stuffy, but don't just go swinging in with like some total hot, nasty take on something. Just get in there, get involved, and tag people in, and so you can slowly start sort of creating content, but in small chunks. And then thereafter, you can sort of work with people, or you can start posting slightly longer form content, or recording audio, podcasts, for example, or recording video, or whatever it is. And then before you know it, you've got your little corner of content creation that is very kind of natural to what you do. It's kind of consistent, and you maintain your authentic voice, which is really important because people really respond to this authenticity. That's maybe the way in, I'd say. And that way you don't have to worry about immediately sort of doing some, 800-word post on LinkedIn or something. People never read those posts anyway.
Yeah.
Keep it light.
No, definitely. I think that's some great advice for people entering the world of content creation, entering the health tech space. Going back to kind of your time at Babylon, and I saw you had a post and you kind of moved away. Tell us about jumping off the rocket ship as you described and kind of venturing out on your own per se.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? Why didn't you stick around? And what are you doing now?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, it was tough. Like, I'd been at Babylon 4.5 years when I left. And, in part I left because the sort of changing market situation. Babylon was a company that was growing very, very fast, but it requires, access to funding quite easily to do so. And as that changed for a lot of people, it meant that they would change their focus from one area to more of other areas. And so, I'm not sharing anything terribly secretive here. This is Babylon would be serving its the contracts that had sort of built up in the US and so on. And so that meant that they would slow down some of the work in some of the areas that I was working in. And there's this opportunity for me to sort of like move back towards more clinical practice, but I'm all in on digital health now as well. And so I had an opportunity at that point to go, well, I can strike out on my own and try the next thing, or I can continue to stay on in here. And at that point I thought, well, it's maybe time for me to strike out and strike out on, my new thing. What I realized was, I really, like we're talking about networking, I really enjoy the networking. I really enjoy speaking to folk and sharing ideas and so on. And when I was in Babylon, because it was a company and then it was a publicly listed company, the ability to be able to do that as freely as you want is, naturally curtailed a little bit because you're working at a publicly listed company. So I poured a lot of my energy inwards. So I was really kind of involved internally. But what happened when I left Babylon is I realized that all of a sudden, I can just speak to who I want, to who I want now, do what I want within reason, And so I really re-engaged again. And I have to say, I'm like, regardless of what else I'm doing, I'm loving that. I'm loving like hearing from people, meeting people, like getting a good understanding. I suppose it's the product manager mindset now. All of a sudden, when people post on social media, I'm like, oh, that's a really great problem to try and solve. So I quite like that side of things. And then as I tried to work out what happened next, I went back and did a bit more GP work again while I was thinking about things. Spent a bit of time really meditating on like, what is my mission? What is my why? Why do I do any of these things? What do I really want to do going forward? And I realized that if, simply put, my why is that, I get up every day working towards a point that every person on earth gets the care they need based on need and not the ability to pay. Right. Okay. So NHS principle for the world. I want that. Right. I'm not going to talk about how it's funded. I'm just going to say that I want people not to have to worry about it and get great care. Okay. Now, right now, 50% of the world doesn't get great care, doesn't get any care. Right? So how can you go from here to there? So I think, well, the only way to do that is automation. That's literally the only way to solve this problem. And that means automating or augmenting the existing workforce. If you think about that, we need health tech organizations and health systems to build these automations. They're going to need healthcare professionals to work with them. I am one of those healthcare professionals. I can help them do this better. And if we can improve how we work together, we can get to the endpoint faster. So that is what I do now. I work about getting to that endpoint faster, helping companies get access and understand how to use clinical subject matter experts, part one. Part two, help clinical subject matter experts work better with companies. And then part three, do my bit and actually do that work as well. And doing all those things, I'm moving in the right direction. So I set up my consultancy, Curistica, and within that, I'm a kind of generalist. I'm a digital health and innovation generalist, and I help companies and people understand how to take these ideas, turn them into something truly impactful, and actually get out there and deliver them. That's what I do.
No, that's incredible. And I like the way you use your guiding principle of why you do it to move forward. Conscious of time, and the last question is, you essentially went from an intrapreneur to an entrepreneur. Tell us about that transition, because all of a sudden you leave this kind of massive publicly listed company and you're out to kind of fend for yourselves, right? You're out there, you're networking, you're trying to generate revenue, you're trying to give value. Tell us about that shift.
Yeah, it's the first thing to say is, if you're a doctor doing this, and you've maintained your license to practice, a lot of the fear goes away because all of a sudden you're just like, you know what, if really things aren't picking up, I'll go and do some shifts. We can speak another time about, hanging up your stethoscope or not. That's another thing. But, I continue to do that side of things. So that made things a little bit easier. The next thing was all of a sudden, it's a little bit like one of those, those menus you get, which have just got like 1,000 photos of different food. It's like, you got like, yeah, exactly. And that's right. You hate it, but you got like order anything under the sun. You're like, so what am I going to order? Now, it's a silly sort of metaphor, but actually in part, once you come out, all of a sudden you're like, well, I know all these things I can do. What am I going to do? And you can approach that by literally seeing what people approach you for. Like people come to you and say, I want you to do this. That's fine. Or you could spend a bit of time and think, well, what do I want to do? And turn that menu from a very, very sort of like sheets of A4 into something slightly narrower. You spend a wee bit of time thinking about, look, what do I really want? Like I literally wrote down like my vision, my mission, my values, my why, my how, my what, according to like all these things. I took a couple of weeks off, and my wife and I went to South Africa. Nice. And while I was there, I was jotting these things down, read a few books. And now I've got that. So that menu is still pretty broad, but it's that wee bit narrower. And so I've got a little bit more headspace now to try and pick my way to what happens next. But it's a little bit, it's really exciting. Yeah. Right? It's really fun. But it can be a wee bit overwhelming too. So to that end, I make sure that I continue to speak to friends and other members of the sort of wider ex-Babylon network and, and other people too, because we're all learning. And ultimately we'll have a much clearer way into things. But for now, keep networking, keep sharing, because you learn everything every day. And that's the other great thing about it, is that I'm still learning stuff, and that's magic.
No, definitely.
Amazing.
Thank you for sharing that, because I have a feeling a lot of people similar to you kind of work for these health tech companies and then will want to spin out and do their own thing. Even from Huma, we had kind of a surgery hero. They met there and they spinned out and did their own startup, and it's that transition from clinician to health tech, digital health, entrepreneur, becoming a founder, down the entrepreneurship route.
Yeah, of course. There's lots of there's entrepreneur first, and there's all sorts of different ways into it too. I'm excited for people that are listening to this, because it's kind of scary and stuff. But the biggest thing that I got when I made this change was like, thank crikey, I'm just like, I've now got control. I can do what I want now. The freedom to do what you want comes with the responsibility to think about what you're doing. So you do have to pause a little bit and speak to people, and sometimes getting coaching. I've got a great coach who kind of helps take some of these thoughts out the way. But you're free to explore, and that's just awesome.
No, I think that is the perfect ending to this. I wish we had more time to talk about your career, but we covered some key points, and I know a lot of our listeners will be interested to hear. Massive thank you, Keith, for taking the time out. I know you're super busy, and a massive thank you to our listeners. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. It's been my delight. We'll maybe speak again about some other stuff. Always happy.
For sure. We'll definitely do so.